Hello, darling humans. Thais Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. So where are we in the world? I think this is officially week 5 of my self-quarantine. The days seem to blur together. So to be honest, I'm not quite sure how long I've been in quarantine, but it's a weird state to be in self-quarantine for a month now. You know, they say it takes 21 days to create a habit, right? I have no idea where they got that from. Probably some really pop psych research. But, I think that there is truth to the fact that after a while, things become more familiar. And so we're entering this stage where we've kind of maybe renounced to the fact that this is the way, like the shock is a little over. So we're kind of like, okay, like we're in this, but we're still experiencing a lot of resistance, right? And still very much dreaming of like, when will this be over? And a really important facet of change that I think is talked about, underrated, not given as much space as I think it needs to, is to mourn the loss. There's always a loss when there's change. There's always a loss when there's change. And even if we are so excited about the new thing, the change, let's say a change is like moving for a new job or getting married, etc. Even when the thing is exciting, it is valid to be mourning a loss. And I want to spend this episode diving a little bit more into my thoughts on this because it's very prevalent to my heart. So let's do the little intro thing and get into it. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thais Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. Okay, so loss. As we are adjusting to a new reality, I think we're coming more and more to terms with the fact that things aren't going to go back to business as usual whenever this pandemic does end. Whatever it looks like on the other side of this, I have a feeling that things are going to be different. Things have shifted. Things have changed. For better, for worse, there's going to be a different way of relating, I think, to each other in terms of just being conscientious and more respectful of disease, of sickness, hopefully. I mean, that's, I think, a really empathic, grounded change would be for us to be more aware of our interconnectedness and our impact on each other, even as something as shaking hands, right? And hopefully more respect for people and more flexibility for when they need to work from home. I don't know. I kind of love this idea, though it's not a fully formulated thought of like, what if we could create a society where our lives could have like these resting periods in a way that doesn't obviously create this entire economic demise. But I guess what I'm saying is like, I'm also seeing how the air in LA is so much clearer than it's ever been. I hear that more animals are returning to national park, not returning, but they're flourishing without human presence. And so obviously the earth is benefiting a lot from this. And so, but there's a lot of humans that are suffering from this. So how do we find a balance? How do we prioritize nature in a way that doesn't devalue human life? How can both be true? Because right now we're valuing human life at the expense. Well, actually, it's not human life that we're valuing, right? It's like capitalism and yeah, I don't think we're valuing human life or nature life. So like, how can we insert a whole different value system into our lives? And so while we're holding space for all this kind of wonderment, I think it's very real experience to also have a moment of resistance to this being something that's happening. I think resistance to how life is and a lack of desire for things to change is a valid human response. But uncertainty is very scary for the human brain. But at a certain point, I think we're finding that resistance creates more pain. Resisting what is, resisting to really acknowledge what is happening causes a tremendous amount of pain. And so the thing I've been thinking about is, well, how do we drop that resistance? How can we be more in the flow of how things are? How can we be more in connection to how things are? Because there's a power in accepting what is. There's such a power in that it's pretty much the built-in value system for all prominent religions and spiritual beliefs, is that when we resist what is, we create suffering, right? This is Buddhism, and accepting what is the key to peace. And so it's hard, though. It's hard to accept what is, because we tend to think that accepting means we're allowing, we're condoning, we're saying that that's okay. But that's actually not what accepting is. Like a really important critical component of mourning the loss of the death of a loved one is accepting that they've died. That doesn't mean, of course, that you're happy that they died. It doesn't mean that you find joy in their death. Of course not. You're mourning. It's a loss. It's a tremendous death. But we have to name that death happened. And one of the rituals that we do to name that the death happened is a funeral. If we don't even accept that the death happened, we can't move forward in our healing. It just doesn't happen. We act as if that person is still alive. That means the things, the responsibilities are going to fall. Life cannot be functional if we don't accept. And we see that in so many different facets of our lives, don't we? I mean, I'm noticing I've been going through some health issues this past year that I still don't have a diagnosis for, and I've kind of hinted at it over the past year. I'm still not tremendously interested in kind of disclosing what's been going on, but I will say that this health stuff has really forced me to evaluate how much resistance I have to accepting that I'm having some health issues. Kind of living life as normal, right? Kind of putting into the unconscious that there's a health issue happening. And I think many of us do this because we believe that if we accept it, if I were to accept that this health issue is happening, that means that I have to really face it. And if I'm diminishing it, minimizing it, pretending that it's not happening, then I don't really have to face the overwhelming feelings and unconscious experiences that are just right there waiting for me to acknowledge them, but I don't feel prepared to acknowledge them. So there's a lot of benefits to resisting how things are, and to hoping that by resisting or minimizing or not accepting or not acknowledging, etc., that somehow that means that we don't have to then take responsibility. And so I can see that in my health, and I see that culturally in what is happening with the pandemic. I can also see it in the lives of my clients as they're trying to get adjusted to this new normal. For some people's new normal means being unemployed, and that's really scary. For some people's new normal, it means having a life experience that feels even better, and they're scared of going back to the way things were. They don't want things to go back to the way things were. They are secretly enjoying this experience. Of course, not enjoying it. No one enjoys, people suffering, but they're getting pleasure out of being isolated or being disconnected a little bit and resting. So we're all having a variety of different human experiences here, and it is so tempting to gloss over the fact that wherever there is a change, there is a loss. And so one of the things that I wrote on Instagram is, may we make space to mourn the lives we no longer have in order to make space for the life that is here in front of us. And that's the key. That is the key to dropping the resistance, right? How do we drop the resistance? We mourn. We name the loss. We give ourselves space to be with the grief. Loss hurts, and mourning and grief is holy. It connects us to a divine love. A radical connection to love is literally on the other side of loss and sadness and grief and despair. Love and sadness, fear, all of these emotions, they're not that far away from each other. I know we tend to think of it more of like a spectrum, like love is on one side and then fear is on the other, but they're actually so intimately close to one another. Because of my health crisis, I had to do an MRI, the millionth MRI, it feels like. And as I was in that machine, I was thinking about my death. I think that that's a pretty common experience when you're in an MRI machine, don't you think? You're kind of not able to move, and you have a loud machine going off all around you. Who knows what that's doing to the body? I mean, I don't know how the magnetic things work, and how they're getting a picture of the inside of my body. It's wild what science can do. But as I was laying there, thinking about death and thinking about how afraid of death I am, and thinking about what it would mean to die and what it would mean to not exist, and what it would mean if my health were to deteriorate to such a point that like I would not be able to function in life. And right there, right on the other side of that thought, was a tremendous amount of love for my life, for my partner and my dog, for living in the city that I live in, for breathing, for being able to eat, for being able to take in, to digest, to comprehend, to be human. It was right there. It was right next to each other. It wasn't on the spectrum where one was far away from the other. It was just the next thought over. And in that surrendering moment of mourning, of admitting that there's a loss, not that I'm dying, although we are all dying, but that's not what I'm talking about in that moment, was really an acknowledgement of my pain, an acknowledgement that I'm hurting, that I'm experiencing a loss of vitality right now through my health issues. I was accessing also a deep love that I have for myself and my life. So loss and accepting loss, as much as it may feel really scary, and as much as we try to diminish it and deny it, if we can face it, what we will find is a tremendous capacity that we have as humans to love and to live. And we want to tap into that capacity, because that's the capacity for our resilience. That's the capacity that we have to overcome trauma and heal and connect and experience intimacy and delight in our lives. While we continue to face away, while we continue to ignore the pain that is here, the loss that is here, as long as we're facing away, we cannot simultaneously experience radical love. If we diminish any part of ourselves, we're diminishing all parts of ourselves. Yeah. So, in that light, let us make space to mourn. Let us make space to mourn. We are all losing something here. We are losing the life that we had. This is going to be in the history books, the pandemic of 2020, and the ways that we responded is going to be in history forever. What is happening around the world it's never happened before. This is a tremendous calamity. And, we can try to find all sorts of reasons and meaning behind it, and we can deduce why things are happening. But I actually find that there's very little value in trying to find meaning before processing the loss. Meaning is the last step towards healing. If we jump to making meaning, we're spending too much time in our prefrontal cortex, in our brain, our logic, versus our emotions, right? Which is in the limbic system. So let us compassionately put down the need to make meaning of why this is happening, and see if we can really face that this is happening, and that because this is happening, so much has been lost. We can talk about the people who have died. Maybe you know someone who has died of COVID-19, and there's that loss. There's the loss of a human life. But that's not the only loss, right? There is a loss of the plans that you had. I had beautiful plans for 2 weeks, in 2 weeks, to go to the East Coast. I was going to introduce my partner. He's never been to Boston, so I was going to show him Boston. We were going to go to New York City, and I was going to see my dear childhood friend. And then we were going to spend a week in my hometown of Frederick, Maryland, and see my parents that I haven't seen in a year and a half. It was going to be a really exquisite trip. We were really looking forward to it. We had everything booked, and we had to cancel it. And that's a bummer. And it's a privilege that we had that opportunity. And I'm naming that privilege, but not in a dishonoring of my humanity, because I was allowed to be looking forward to that trip, and I'm allowed to be upset by that trip. naming that in the context of things like, wow, it's amazing that I get to travel. And also, wow, it hurts that got taken away. It doesn't matter how small the loss is. It doesn't matter how big the loss is. There is no comparison of pain. Pain is pain is pain. There is no hierarchy of pain. All pain is valid, and there's no need to compare. And we're not comparing, right? We're not comparing. Because there's no need for it. No one can say that your pain is less than. Your pain is valid. And so whatever loss you experience because of this crisis is allowed to take space in your life. It's allowed to be acknowledged. It's allowed to be named. And so what do I mean by naming? I mean, it's simple as that. Simply being aware of what we've lost, whether you journal that, whether you just say it out loud, whether you say it to a friend. The process of saying, wow, I'm missing this. Wow, this is something that I no longer get to do or get to experience or get to feel or get to be with. Because of everything that's happening in the world. That's naming. And there is a tremendous power in naming. Because when we name, we cannot deem it invisible. When we name, we're bringing it into our consciousness. We're bringing it into our awareness. We're becoming more attuned to that part of us. So naming has the ability for us to give space to what we're experiencing. And so, yes, we get to imagine a new earth. And maybe, hopefully, we'll move the meter a little bit in the direction that we want. There's, I oscillate between hope and despair. Hope that because of the things that we've experienced because of this pandemic, that we'll be able to shift the world towards a more positive, balanced experience, as I named earlier. But there's also despair. I mean, I'm not very happy with the direction that our country is moving in. I'm not pleased with how our elected officials are choosing to lead us through this crisis. I mean, I just have so many opinions about how things are being dealt with. That really saddens me. And sometimes I feel like nothing's ever really going to change for the better. I'm too radical, I guess. I have too many radical beliefs, and it's frustrating to see the limits of our planet. But our planet is limited. Humans are limited. We are limited. We are limited by our bodies. We're limited by our emotional pain. We are limited, and that's not a bad thing. What do I mean by that? I mean by that is like it is what it is. It is being human. Being human means having limitations, and we have to accept our limitations because our limitations inform us of our humanity. And so where have you not been giving yourself space to mourn the loss of the lives we will not have anymore? Give space for that. Give yourself space. What do I mean by that? Carve space into your calendar to spend some time naming, journaling, being with the parts of you that are lost, the experiences that you won't have, the things you've had to say goodbye to, the challenges that have been coming up because of this experience. Again, this is not the last step, right? I love the story. We just celebrated Easter this past weekend, and even though I'm not religious, I like the symbology of Easter. I like the idea that the resurrection was not the last step. And I know I'm sure I've named this story before, but I love it so much. And it was introduced to me by Rob Bell, who I respect a lot as a kind of, I don't actually know what his title is. Is he considered a pastor? I don't know, but he was a pastor. I don't know if he is anymore or if that's what he titles himself. But he introduced me to this concept of seeing Easter as not the last step, right? There's the crucifixion, but then there was the resurrection. The crucifixion of death was not the last step. Accepting death is not the last step. Accepting death is the first step. Once we can accept, once we can name that this happened, not that we're okay with it, but that it's happening, we can give space to further healing, further mourning, which will then lead us towards further love. It will lead us to the resurrection, to the rising of our humanity, to the rising of our experience of our own hearts. I love the birds outside. It's a beautiful, beautiful opportunity that we're being given here if we choose to call into it, to deepen into our humanity. There is no ideal scenario here, right? Like, we're all facing complexity of both hope and despair. We don't know what the ideal situation is. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's next, but we can focus on opening up to what is here, and naming all of the blocks that are keeping us from being with what is here. Because the irony is, right, like while I'm refusing to really accept that I'm having health issues, the more I resist getting care, the more I resist making the changes necessary to make myself feel physically better. That's what's so wild. If we don't name and accept what is here, we can't then make adjustments necessary for our fullness. And so we are being invited to mourn so that we can awake. Mourn so we can pay attention. Mourn so we can face what is here with compassion and joy. Maybe not always gratitude. I don't think there's always gratitude, but certainly like a grounding, right? A grounding in our resilience. Okay? So that's what I have to offer all of you today. I'm sending you all of my love. These are rough times, my friends. You're allowed to have the pendulum swing up and down of all of the feelings as you're moving through this. We are in this together, but I know this shit is really hard right now in all of the ways. I'm honoring you. I'm honoring our humanity. I'm honoring our experience. We will get through this. I don't know how, but we'll get through this. I will catch you next week. Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thais Sky and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.